Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 173 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. I am your host, Joseph Arvidsson, and as always, I am here to dive deep into the criminal justice system, sharing stories, perspectives, and insights that ignite the fire for change. Before we dive into today's enthralling conversation, I have some exciting news. For those of you who might be in or around New York City the last week of August, I will be there as well. Thrilled to remind you that I will be presenting some workshops at the upcoming American Probation and Parole Association's New York City Training Institute. This is a fantastic opportunity to deepen our understanding, connect, and share knowledge. And guess what? If you are attending, or if you're just even in the area, I would absolutely love to meet some of our dedicated listeners in person. Let's connect, chat, share our passion for reform. Stick around till the end of this interview, and I'm going to share some more details about the APPA event and how we can all catch up. Now, let's set the stage for our guest today. If you believe in transformation, in redemption, and the incredible power of determination, then this episode is crafted just for you. We have in our midst Glenn E. Martin. From the confines of incarceration to standing as a vanguard of prison reform, Glenn's journey is nothing short of monumental. We will unearth his story, discuss the intricate challenges of reentry, explore the potential of technology and reshaping reentry programs, and so much more. And for all our housing enthusiasts out there, we're diving into that realm too. So whether you're driving, jogging, or just lounging, this is the episode to immerse yourself in. Prepare to be enlightened, inspired, and called to action. Please enjoy my interview with Glenn Martin, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Glenn. So glad to have you on. Why don't we just kick this off by you sharing with the audience your personal journey from incarceration to becoming a prominent advocate for prison reform. What inspired you to take on that transformative role?
Sure. Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. You're bringing me back now, 23 years. So I served 6 years in prison in New York State, and I earned a 2-year quality liberal arts degree on the way out. And I come home like most people coming out of prison thinking, I need to get a job, get it right, keep it together, keep parole off my back. Visit about 50 different employers within, a month's period, and get turned down over and over and over again based solely on the criminal record. And I'm like, wait a minute, this feels like a stigma I'll never get by. End up talking to a guy named George Leno, formerly incarcerated guy who was running a reentry organization at the time. And he was just relentless. He was just like, I'm going to get you a job and I'm not going to give up on you. And that meant literally knocking on my door every day. I landed at a job at a nonprofit public interest law firm. At the time, I was thinking, nonprofit, how are you going to pay me if you don't make any profit? And realized quickly that I landed at a very important nonprofit doing really important work. Learned how to do policy advocacy work from the attorneys who had been there for decades, doing it collectively, and went on to really shape the way I thought about policy reform, and ultimately became vice president at a large, long-standing reentry organization called the Fortune Society. And then went on to build my own organization at Just Leadership USA, because I quickly realized that I was becoming the exception as opposed to the rule, and wanted to invest in other formerly incarcerated leaders. And then later on into consulting with a bunch of nonprofits and even real estate. And we can touch on that if it makes sense later on.
Yeah, we'll circle back to your real estate and other fantastic updates. I wanted to pause because when you were mentioning your frustration in attempting to secure employment and the hurdles that you were hitting because of that criminal conviction, something the public probably doesn't know a lot about, but some states are working. I'm here in Minnesota, and our legislation around what we call ban the box, that it's just so much of a stigma to look at someone's criminal history. And folks with a lot more letters after their name than me, who are a lot smarter, have said, the data shows that one's criminal history is really only predictive for about a period of 5 years. And after that, it doesn't really predict. It's just a wash after that. The question should not be, do you have a criminal record, but rather, how long ago was your period of offending? Because it carries an inordinate stigma for folks trying to reintegrate.
Yeah, in our criminal justice system, we have a ceremony that takes away people's citizenship, their self-esteem, you name it. We call it sentencing. And we don't have an equal ceremony to bring people back. And we sort of leave people there. And so ban the box is one important way to separate out when the criminal record is considered versus whether a person is otherwise qualified. And you're right, Al Blumstein and other researchers have done research to show that after a certain amount of time, that people essentially desist from committing crime. And in fact, people even age out of having the appetite for risk, to engage in criminal behavior. But the question is, can we close the gap between, employer fears, whether legitimate or perceived, and the reality of what the data says, which is that people who are employed actually reoffend at much lower rates. In fact, 83% of people who violate on probation or parole are unemployed at the time of violation.
I resisted the urge to nerd out, and I was going to cite Al Blumstein, and you beat me to the punch. So yes, that was Al's research that showed it's no longer predictive. And when you talked about sentencing, it reminded me of something that my dear friend Shad Maruna talks about, that the criminal justice system does a really good job of stigmatizing folks, and he has a lot of good content on what he refers to as degradation ceremonies. And he said, if you consider an individual's trajectory through the criminal justice system, each one of those touch points, if you will, he refers to as degradation ceremonies. We're there celebrating an individual's failure, whether it's their first certification as a juvenile or their first conviction as an adult, or as you noted, Glenn, sentencing, probation violations, parole violations. Every contact that individual has with the criminal justice system, it's a degradation ceremony. We're celebrating those failures. And to your point, and this is Shad's point as well, on the flip side, we don't have any sort of welcome back ceremony or you've been healed ceremony or anything like that. I did see some research that said in France, they're actually playing around with a novel approach where they have just what I'm articulating here. They actually bring the individual back to the very courtroom that they were sentenced in, and they get their sort of redemption certificate. But we don't have anything like that in the U.S. I, for years and years, was a practicing probation officer, and the closest I came to that, Glenn, when somebody wrote out their term of supervision was sending them a semi-form letter saying, "Dear Mr. Martin, this is to signify your sentence has expired. Good luck in all future endeavors." That's it. But yeah, it's just so lopsided.
Yeah, no, we have a system that unfortunately, one is adversarial. So there's no idea that we're sort of all in this together, if you will. Number two, it's just full of toxic shame from the beginning to the end. People end up being shamed through the system, and then they have to live with that for the rest of their lives, unfortunately. And not many of us make it beyond that. Even if the toxic shame doesn't get in the way of a person getting a job and getting housing and those sort of things, it does get in the way of their full potential. You know, I have people who I speak to almost every day, definitely every week, that are talking to me about some opportunity they want to pursue, and they're hearkening back to their criminal record from 16 years ago, 18 years ago, 20 years ago, and without anyone even telling them they can't take advantage of the opportunity, they themselves are talking themselves out of it because they're stuck in the toxic shame of their involvement in the criminal justice system and the stigma that flows from it.
Yeah, we have a really hard time as practitioners even realizing our role. And I would say in corrections, we sadly too often get hung up on we're still in that sort of punishing role, and we don't realize there is a legitimate role for punishment, but that's for the courts to do. Once they get to your desk, your file, you're in that reintegration role, that rehabilitation role. And that's a great story you just told of somebody whose offense was 16 years ago, and even them personally, it's their self-policing, their self-confidence, their agency, their self-efficacy, because we've just stigmatized them and degraded them to this point that they're going to carry that with them regardless of what their legal supervision status is.
Yeah, can you imagine if you had a small child and he or she spilled a container of milk and you reminded them of that for the next 20, 30 years? Like, just over and over, like as if they could never get beyond that one bad decision or one mistake. That's how our criminal justice system operates. But I will say this, I just got back from Europe, had a chance to go to Hamburg, go to Norway, and see something that looks profoundly different. And I know that my critics around this are going to say, well, Norway is not New York, Norway is not LA. I get that. But I will say this. There's something very inherent to their system that would cost us not a penny, which is human dignity. I heard the words human dignity mentioned about 50 times during that trip, and almost every single time it came from correction staff, not from advocates, not from people pushing the system to change, but literally from the system itself and from people who work within it who believe that their role is actually to invest in the success of the people that they're guarding. I mean, I have an older brother who grew up to be a federal correction officer. We grew up in the same household. But when I talk to him about his job and what the success looks like, it has little to do with whether or not he's seeing people as humans in those cells. It's mostly about security, safety, and those sorts of things. And I'd like to think of my brother as someone who shares many of my values. And at the same time, when he discusses his job, his previous job at this point, he talks about it as if remaining neutral is the pinnacle of doing the right thing. And and I'm like, then why is your job called correction officer? Why is it not called neutral officer?
I love it. Why is it not called neutral officer? Glenn, you brought up Norway. Let's go there. We have a mutual friend and connection in Nina Hansen, who's written a book on the Norwegian prison experience. Listeners of the podcast will recognize that name. She's been on the show not once, but twice, most recently promoting her book. I know you ran into her when she was in New York City as part of her U.S. book tour. And yeah, you don't have to, as you said, think we need to replicate the nation of Norway, but more broadly, just look at the philosophy of what's behind that, which is really what they call dynamic security versus, which your brother articulated, static security, which is all about don't cross that line, don't touch the inmate, security of the building, safety of the officers. But it's not relational at all. It is, but it's transactional. It's transactional, but it's transactional in as far as you do this and I'll do that. You don't do this, I won't do that, type thing. It's not relational as far as I want what's best for you so you never return to this building.
Yeah. So I will say this. If you ask anyone who's been to prison, most people will have some anecdotal story about a correction person who did the right thing in the middle of that madness. And I'm no different. I just wrote an op-ed for the Daily News a few weeks ago here in New York that talked about my experience at Rikers. So I've had multiple experiences at Rikers Island, one of the worst jails in the United States. And the second time I went, my girlfriend at the time had an aunt who worked there as a captain. And so she picked up the phone, called her, put in a good word for me, and it meant my experience looked a lot different than the other 21,000 people who were there at the time. And it meant that this captain put me in touch with the officers who reported to her, told them to treat me well. I found myself getting food that was different than everyone else, doing my laundry more often, being able to shower more often, being treated as a human being, sitting in front of a computer, using a telephone, things that were not available to 99.9% of people who were on Rikers at the time. And it just had a profound effect on my ability to pay attention to how to make the most of a really crappy situation. And I would argue that it actually led to me ending up in a college program after I left Rikers and seeing some value in myself beyond the immediate challenge that I found myself in. And yet at the same time, I've always asked myself since then, what would it mean to treat everyone who's in the system like a human being and to extend some of these opportunities to them? And how do you scale that? And, I would think it through and it would seem as if I was having, a Disney sort of story play out in my head. And then I go to Norway and I'm like, wait a minute. This is what it looks like at scale. Mm-hmm. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish. I'm sure there are tons of challenges in the Norwegian system also. And I know it took them decades to get to where they are today. But to be able to see something that was embedded with human dignity at scale as an advocate just reinforced for me the possibilities of what we might be able to accomplish here in the United States. And you won't do it overnight, and there'll be a lot of naysayers, but I think it's worth it. And we're starting to see some small glimpses of that happening, partially because of the work of people like Nina and others.
Yeah, I agree. We could at least start to scale up and get there. And when I hear those, well, we're not Norway, it strikes me as just sort of a knee-jerk, we can't do this, so let's not even try type thing. And when you talked about meeting that one prison officer who altered your trajectory, yes, Glenn, you're right. I've talked to other folks who've desisted, and they often say the same thing. It was, I met one prison officer, or I finally had a probation officer who understood me, or a parole officer who I had a connection with. And I always feel a little bit conflicted because on the one hand, I consider myself this grand proponent of core correctional skills and evidence-based practices, which of course I believe in, but also I realize at the end of the day, it just boils down to those human connections,
I appreciate you saying that because, I've never met someone successful. Like I was the vice president at the Fortune Society, very large reentry program. At the time I was there, served about 4,000 people per year. I think they're up to serving about 10,000 people per year now, years later. But I would never meet someone who went through Fortune, came back years later and say, well, what worked for you, man? You're doing really well. What worked? No one ever said, well, Glenn, it was that your analysis, man. That really changed my life. Or they would say something like, yeah, it was that guy, Michael, the manager of housing, who took me into his office. I had just gotten home from prison. He was busy. And as soon as I came to his door, he dismissed his staff, brought me in, sat with me, talked to me for 30 minutes. And that was just a game changer for me, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? That's a truism for human beings all across the board, right? It's not just criminal justice.
Right.
If you ask a successful CEO what worked for him or her, they won't talk about that workshop they took at Harvard. They'll talk about that person who invested in them or saw something in them that they didn't see in themselves. And honestly, I wouldn't have gone to college if a correction counselor didn't say to me, you should go to college. I thought it was a joke, given that it was one of the worst moments of my life. But he meant it. I probably couldn't point him out if I sat across from him on the train today, on the subway. But at the same time, that story was 30-something years ago, and I still remember it as if it were yesterday.
Yeah, I do an exercise when I train on motivational interviewing, and I ask the attendees to reflect on one person who really inspired them and led them to make some leap of faith that they would have otherwise not made. And it's typically, for example, a school teacher or a coach, but it's along the lines of what we're talking about here, Glenn. Everybody has that person that they just had that connection that altered that trajectory and changed their pathways. Which for you, I'm glad that happened because you went on to found, among other things, Just Leadership USA. You played a significant role in advocating for criminal justice reform with Just Leadership USA. What were some of the key initiatives and campaigns that you led that you feel really impacted the system with Justice Leadership USA?
Yeah, thanks for that. So when I was at the Fortune Society, by any stretch of the imagination, I was doing really well, definitely well as a formerly incarcerated person, but just generally professionally well. And my trajectory probably would have been to ultimately run the organization one day. But I realized that people were putting me on a pedestal. And the more I emerged as the exception to the rule, is the more I was playing a role in reinforcing the rule. The idea that the majority of people are not going to make it, the majority of people are not intelligent, where my experience was that we lock up some of America's best and brightest. And so I left Fortune to launch Just Leadership USA to make the case that there were many Glens across the country. It's just that this Glen happened to be, I'm not exceptional. I was exposed to exceptional opportunities. And how do we expose other formerly incarcerated people to these opportunities? And so one of the things I'm most proud of is the year-long training that I was able to help pull together that has now created arguably hundreds of formerly incarcerated people doing advocacy work across the country, running organizations, working for government, all of these amazing roles that have helped inform the way our criminal justice system operates. Because if you have a system that is archaic and mean-spirited and harmful because it dehumanizes the people who are involved in it, then the thing you need to do is to rehumanize those folks. And the best way to rehumanize people is to hear from them directly. So that was part of my theory of change, is that I needed to invest in other formerly incarcerated people. So that's one thing I'm really proud of. The second thing was our first advocacy campaign, which was the effort to convince the city of New York to shut down Rikers Island. And the reason I think that campaign was so important is that, one, for obvious reasons, Rikers Island is a torture island in the backyard of one of the most progressive, resource-rich cities in the United States. If you've ever flown in and out of LaGuardia, then you have been 200 feet away from Rikers Island. And it's just a very terrible place that was purchased from a man who actually used to capture free black men and return them into the slaveholding South, Richard Riker, the head of our courts back then. But the campaign to close Rikers was important because, one, it was successful. So New York is moving towards shutting down Rikers, taking longer than I would like, but we'll get there. And number two, it inspired people from around the country to think, wait a minute, it's not that we're not going to lock people up, but if we're going to lock people up, like, do we have to treat them the way we treat people at Rikers? And I think that it has pushed a conversation that is at least allowing people to think, can we do things differently, not only in terms of diversion, but if a person's going to be in a carceral setting, how do we take lessons from places like Norway and others about how we do it in a way that actually lends itself to less victimization later on? Like, how do we, like, if we really care about victims, then we should do more of what works and less of what doesn't. And one of the things that work is to really be thoughtful about where people end up serving their time.
I love you brought up victims, and that's one of the retorts I'll get from critics sometime is, well, Joe, I'm all about public safety. I'm all about the victim. And I say to myself, I am too. I'm playing the long game, though. I'm thinking about those victims down the road. You're playing the short game about, more the retribution and payback for a past victim, which we'll get into restorative justice here. When you were speaking, it reminded me of an experience I had just recently. Last month, I was out in California, and I got the chance to tour a couple of their juvenile facilities, up to and including the incredible Campus Kilpatrick. But my tour guide out there, Rafael Ventura of LA County Probation, introduced me to, we were walking around these open campuses, and I saw individuals that I at first thought they must be staff members. They had the credentials on and whatnot. And then finally, I kept hearing this term thrown about, like, hey, where's so-and-so? Hey, where's so-and-so? And the term was, they were referring to these credible messengers, as they called them. But it was basically, as you can connect the dots, formerly justice-involved individuals coming back as mentors into the facilities, which is a great concept. And I just love the name, credible messengers. I mean, I'm fairly well educated and well trained, and I'd like to think of myself as a subject matter expert. But at the end of the day, having never walked that pathway, there's something that I just can't bring to the table. So it's great to see that they were tapping into this mindset of we have a lot of subject matter experts in the field, but we just sort of have this arm's length reaction to, well, we don't want to bring back former probationers or former clients, but we do want to do that. I also think it leads into, you mentioned assistance earlier, Glenn, which we talk a lot about on this podcast, but if you really do a deep dive into the desistance literature, you'll see that you'll keep coming across this term generativity, which is this notion that it's not just about not recidivating. It's about, I have to help out others and give my advice just to even maybe alter one person's pathway, or arguably hundreds of people's pathways. But yeah, I think we really do need to exploit that sense of generativity that folks with lived experience can leverage to help reform the system.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. My entire career, for better or for worse, has been practice to theory, as opposed to theory to practice. I've really trusted my gut and what my gut has told me and the wisdom I've built through actual experience. And it's a difficult way to live life, trust me. Like, I have learned so much from my bad decisions, my mistakes, and just sort of taking a swing at things based on what my gut is telling me. But still, it's a different form of education, a different form of professional trajectory, and it's worked for me. And the reason I bring that up is when I came out of prison and I landed at the Legal Action Center, the nonprofit public interest law firm I worked at, and then ultimately at the Fortune Society. Initially, I was not valuing what my instincts were, because I was thinking, I don't have the credentials these folks have. I didn't go to Harvard. I didn't go to Yale. I didn't go to NYU. I didn't go to Columbia. But I quickly realized that my experience was valuable. And the context of having been in the situation means that I know something that these other folks in this room who are well-intentioned, who are doing good work, but they just don't know because they haven't experienced it. And I started couching it as people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but often furthest from power and resources. And I started saying that out loud more and more often as a way to open up a conversation about the value of people directly impacted, being in leadership, being in decision-making roles, being in partnership. Like, don't speak for me, speak with me. Like, we're more powerful together having this conversation. And again, it came to me almost commonsensical. Like, you wouldn't have a women's movement without women in leadership. You wouldn't redesign a hospital emergency room without talking to patients. There was just so many different examples where I said to myself, this is a really strange effort to undo our criminal justice system without including people like myself, and really, really pushed hard for that. And it has been, I think it has taken us from moment to movement. I really do think there is something that feels palatable and like it has longevity. And I think a huge part of that is that people have actually realized that directly impacted people need to be involved. I'll say something else that's controversial for some people, but worth saying out loud. When I first met the movement, if you will, I'm putting quotes around that, there was a conversation about making sure that the first time nonviolent drug offender did not go to prison. And that was laughable to me then, as it is today, because that's not who I met in prison. Like, I met some really smart, brilliant people in prison, but the first time nonviolent drug offender kind of went home on probation. Like, he or she actually didn't end up in prison. So I said to myself, if we're really going to end mass incarceration and we're going to have less people locked up and more people exposed to opportunities, we need to get past that very simplistic version of what we think happens in prison. And the only way to do that is to hear from people who actually have more serious convictions. Mm-hmm. You know, like, you can be convicted of burglary and have that be a violent crime, even if no one was home, in most states in the United States. And until I thought that Americans hear from people who have ended up in the situation of having those types of convictions and seeing them as having opportunity and vision and hope, would never turn the system around. And I think we're far away from that now. You know, for better or for worse, I do think that most people have sort of come out of the closet around the idea of having a criminal record. Why? Because it's been led by people like myself who've taken the risk of coming out of the closet early on, if you will.
I love that insight. And you're right. For the longest time, you would hear as you just said, the sort of cliched drug offender with no convictions shouldn't be in prison. And that's sort of low hanging fruit, but it doesn't do anything. It continues to perpetuate this us, them. Yeah, you're right. Don't lock those people up because my uncle struggled with chemicals, but lock up the dangerous, violent. Well, we're back to square one now. Us versus them. This binary approach we take to reform. Great minds think alike, Glenn. When you were talking about how silly it is now in hindsight not to involve justice-involved individuals in criminal justice reform, I've literally said, yeah, it's like redesigning hospitals without talking to patients, or redesigning our education system without getting student input. I mean, in any other vocation, you would see how ludicrous this is, but you still have people digging in their heels saying, yeah, that sounds great, Joe, but, prison rules say that Glenn can't come back into the facility because we don't allow people in with convictions. The same Glenn that the warden just said, hey, we're flying in a subject matter expert, but it's going to get tripped up on this silly, technicality, for lack of a better term.
You just reminded me that 2013 or 2014, I got invited to the White House to have a talk about criminal justice reform. And I met with about 35 of my colleagues at a local law school in D.C. before we walked over to the White House. And so we spent a few hours thinking about what we wanted to discuss when we got to talk to the policy advisors, domestic policy advisors. This was during the Obama administration. So we all head over to the White House. I realize I'm the only formerly incarcerated person in the group. And as we start entering the White House, everyone gets these green passes that you hang around your neck that give you access to the White House. And when I get my ID, I get handed a pink pass,
no.
different than everyone else's. And so sure enough, if you have a criminal record and you have to show your ID to go anywhere, you just kind of know something like this might happen. And Secret Service says to me, you can't get in. You can't go in the White House. You need an escort. And I'm like, well, how do I get an escort? They're like, well, the people who invited you, ask them to come get you. I'm like, okay, great. I'll call Valerie Jarrett right now on my cell phone. Ask her to run downstairs and grab me from the front desk. That led to me writing. I got in very late. I missed half the meeting. I was very embarrassed and ashamed. I did make my thinking known when I got into the room. But I also took the Amtrak train back to New York and decided to pen a letter to then President Obama. And by the time I got to New York, decided to issue it as an open letter and shared it with the Wall Street Journal and and a couple of other outlets that were more than interested in publishing it. But listen, the reason I did it was this. I realized that day not being allowed into the White House was just indicative of the larger problem in the United States, that people never get beyond the criminal conviction. And I really wrote the letter not to embarrass the president. I'm sure it was embarrassing to them, but it was actually meant to send a message to the United States. I just thought it was a moment to, yes, out myself further, but to create an opportunity for people to have a meaningful discussion about what does it mean to be stuck with the stigma of a criminal conviction, particularly in a country that disproportionately impacts people of color in our criminal justice system. What does it mean to never get access to the White House, even when you're invited by one of the most, important people in the country?
We've been talking about those roadblocks and barriers, whether it's the conviction in and of itself when you're applying for a job, or your amazing story just now about being denied White House access after being invited. But are there things, are we getting warmer, Glenn? I mean, what are some barriers or some challenges still faced by folks reentering society after incarceration that we still seem to be hung up on, and or are there small successes that we're starting to chip away at?
Yeah, I think part of it is, we live in 50 different countries stitched together, and we call it the United States. So part of it is where you live. Like, I want to be really transparent about that. If you live on the coast, I think you have a much better chance of navigating this reentry. And of course, that's relative. But there's been a lot longer conversation about how to remove statutory and practical barriers to reentry. So, people can vote in many of these states in a way that they couldn't just a decade ago or 2 decades ago. People are able to have access to Pell Grants. We've opened back up access to Pell Grants in a way that hasn't been so for a few decades. But then there are other places like public housing that continue to bar people based on a criminal conviction. Much of it is hyper localized, even though the federal government says these are the things you should consider. They leave a lot of discretion to localities. And, we just saw crime tick upwards over the last couple of years coming out of COVID. And before we even had a chance to figure out why, we had a very visceral reaction that didn't feel too different than the late 90s and the early 2000s. And while violent crime is again ticking down just as quickly as it ticked upwards, I did notice that when it came to policy, people were relying on the same things that they relied on back then, which is more punitiveness and somehow the idea that that's going to lead to deterrence, even after almost 2 decades of criminal justice reform. So luckily, it didn't pick up a lot of traction. I think we're coming out of it, and now people are starting to feel a little bit safer. But I don't want to overplay my hand in saying how much we achieved over the last 2 decades. I mean, for me, the moment that sort of defines the beginning of the movement, strangely, was when George W. Bush, during the State of the Union address, said that we have thousands of people coming home from prison each year and that America is the land of second chances and those people deserve an opportunity, particularly because that created a bipartisan movement around these issues. So I do feel like, it's almost 20 years in, and I think that momentum saved us over the last 3 years or so in terms of draconian policy reforms. But not 100%. Like, we saw some really bad things happen in the last couple of legislative sessions across the country. And I'm just hoping that we can continue to go back in the direction we were going before. And yes, I think formerly incarcerated people are now able to say out loud, I've served time in prison, but let me tell you the rest of this story in a way that they couldn't just 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's what it'll finally take. I mean, I know when we study, for example, implementation science, we talk about technical solutions to adaptive problems. Sometimes, sadly, it's not a policy change or a legislative change. It's changing the mindset, really, which I think, like you said, we're onto that with just how we view folks who've been incarcerated. And it's certainly one of the things I try to do on this podcast. That's why I love having on folks with lived experience, because it just tears down those stigmas and those biases, and it really humanizes the issue. So maybe it's just a matter of again, perspective sharing. I know we were talking before the interview about the upcoming American Probation and Parole Association Annual Training Institute in New York City this August, but I'm really looking forward to connecting with a former guest on the show, a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Fisher, whose film is his documentary, which, fingers crossed, I'm remembering the title, In a Whole New Way. But it's basically his team started out with their first project. They handed portable cameras out to individuals living in public housing in New York City just to share what that experience is like, things that aren't captured in spreadsheets and bar graphs, to really show that perspective. And it was such a hit that they said, hey, do this again, but hand those cameras out to people who are on probation in New York City. And give it to those clients and have them capture that perspective, because, again, you're not going to get that from an essay or a black and white journal abstract or, again, even a well-intended study. And we know this, media just lands on people differently, particularly visual media. So I'm really looking forward to connecting with Jonathan, because, again, I think when we get to we got to change the mindset. We got to change the mindset.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing Jonathan's film. I've heard about it, but it makes me think of a couple things. First of all, if you've never had Adam Gelb on your show, you should probably have Adam Gelb on your show from the Council on Criminal Justice, because he and I make for strange partners in the work that he does. But I absolutely believe in his approach and his balance between what does the data and research tell us, but also we need to be talking to people directly impacted by these issues. And his dad ran the Council on Foreign Relations for years. So it's a great model that he's adopted to the criminal justice space. So I wanted to put that plug there for the Council on Criminal Justice and for Adam Gelb. And then to further dig in, how did we get here? We got here, if you have been around long enough to remember when we had local news here in New York.
Remember that, kids? Local news.
And, if it bleeds, it leads. Yep. So there was a lot of things that would show up on the evening news that, rightfully so, people would be aghast and fearful. And that would often lead to someone in the legislature standing up and proposing some draconian piece of legislation that was overly punitive, that had no form of parsimony or proportionality or social justice or anything. And that would become law by the end of the legislative session, because if you didn't get on board, then you were soft on crime. Mm-hmm. So if that is what got us here, like human stories, right, for better or for worse, in this case for worse, why would we be surprised that human stories wouldn't be part of what helps us get out of here? And that is why I put a lot of value in films like that, and in what technology can also do to help humanize not just people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, but to help contextualize the situations that they find themselves in, because violence is often hugely contextual, and I think that gets lost on people.
Yeah, to your point about leading with the sensational and just sort of leading with the negative, I have often reflected on that. I've never seen a story on we're celebrating someone's early discharge from probation or somebody getting a job after they leave prison. It's just the negative, negative, negative. You just now mentioned technology, Glenn, and that was one of my questions. Do you see a spot for technology in the future, not just with the stories we tell, but really, I've been on a kick lately that we need to, at least in corrections, leverage technology for good. Yeah. Typically, we've been mentioning APPA or any correctional conference, and they have sort of the vendor area that people are trying to, sell their goods. God bless them. But it's always been technology to catch people faster and quicker, whether it's electronic monitoring or more efficient urinalysis testing. And I'm not saying it's not there. I'm seeing it enter the sphere now, but we're just starting to see, as I said, this trend of, well, let's use technology for good. And maybe that'll be part of this whole reimagining of how we view justice-involved individuals.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And unfortunately, the introduction of technology has meant, we can nail people to the wall better with more technology. And obviously, that's not where I land on this. I'll say this. When I was in prison, I was in the college program, and there were 6 computers. 6. We knew we would never get another computer into that prison. We just knew it. Like, whoever got them in the first place, God bless them. But we knew we'd never get any other computers in. I learned not just how to use computers while I was in prison, but literally how to take them apart and fix them, because those were the only 6 computers we'd ever have. And it was important for us to make sure they kept working. That introduction to technology is why I grossed a couple of $1 million last year in my 2 businesses. The idea that you're going to keep technology out of prison is almost embarrassing as a country. Like people in prison, I've seen people in prison make tea in a plastic bottle with fire burning from a roll of toilet tissue, and the tissue being lit by a piece of lead from a pencil. Yes. Like, necessity is the mother of invention. People are going to find ways to engage with technology in prison, whether you like it or not. So you might as well, sort of lean into it and turn it into an opportunity. There's an organization called Promising People that's relatively new, but using virtual reality technology to train people on how to be electricians while they're in prison. Why is that important? Literally, the VR technology is so good, you don't need Wi-Fi to make it work. And people get the experience of literally putting together the things they would have to put together on the outside in person through virtual reality. They get to make choices. When they make choices, things go right, things go wrong. All of it happens through VR. They're able to take the VR back into their cells. The technology is so great that people can't misuse it. There's no way, there's ways to get around any security issues that people might have. We should have been doing this years ago. We're just starting to do it now. Unfortunately, they had to take one of their first projects outside of the United States just to get a yes in the Virgin Islands. And they are eager, ready to go. It's a company founded by a formerly incarcerated person. It is exactly what we should be doing. I know places like Meta and others are hugely interested in this. So we also have the technology companies hugely interested. And this is where I think sometimes the advocates get it wrong. And I'm an advocate, so I just want to be clear. Like, I'm an advocate for reform, but having done advocacy work for over 2 decades, I also realize there's a crop of advocates that are so absolutists and so purists that the idea that you would introduce any technology into the system means somehow that you're advocating for the system to exist. And most of those people are people who've never sat in a prison cell. Because if you're going to put me in a prison cell for 23 hours a day, and I get a choice between having a virtual reality set or just sitting there looking at the goddamn walls, excuse my expression, give me that VR set. People on the inside are chomping at the bit for jobs, for ways to learn, for ways to grow, for ways to expand, for ways to contribute. And I think technology is a big part of that.
And it reminds me also, when you spoke of virtual reality, and this is something I learned from our friend Nina Hansen when she was talking about the success of the Norwegian prison approach. And she said one of the things they embrace is this concept, this normalcy principle. Like, the prison should be as close to the outside as possible, or as normal, as we say. And I thought to myself, boy, that's just, I mean, an indication of how far culturally we are from that, Glenn. Think how many prison corrections officials would bristle at even the concept of, well, let them wear their street clothes. I mean, it's, that's normal. Like, let them, but why do we have to make them wear these silly orange pajamas other than just to degrade and stigmatize them? But again, if you think about it on a continuum, okay, if we're struggling with the concept of you can wear street clothes, then to your point about VR or computers, or again, anything that's replicating normal life on the outside, there's just this big chasm still.
Except if you want to be even a janitor, if that's the right term these days, good luck doing it without knowing how to use a computer. Right? You won't even know how to order supplies. And when I was in Norway, I saw that their commissary, the place where people go to buy food and so on, compared to the United States, is so different. In the United States, you fill out a form somewhere in a cell and you hand in that paper form, and a week later you go with a wheelbarrow and pick up, what you ordered, if you will. That's so, what supermarket works that way? Whereas in Norway, you go in, you shop, you bring it up to the counter, they bring you out. It just feels extremely normal. And yes, I saw people wearing their personal clothing, and I don't think I can understate how much that lends itself to people's sense of individuality and value and worth, essentially. But yeah, I mean, it's going to take us a while. Part of it is transparency, I think. I think that the best thing we can do for our prison system is light, and more light. And I think that the more we open it up and the more we invest in a new crop of correction officials who actually see themselves as successful when people come out and there is a sense of normalcy, is the more we'll move away from the system that actually generates further criminal behavior afterwards. I think that's the challenge here, is we're not telling the truth about what we're generating in our prison system.
You mentioned a new crop of prison officials coming in. Let's just broaden it out and say a new crop of corrections officials. Glenn, from your position, if you could give one piece of advice to somebody who just got hired to work in their local prison, or let's just say even a probation or parole officer, just broadly speaking, what's one piece of advice that you would give that person going into their 20 or 30-year career?
Yeah, the first thing I'm going to say is probably going to surprise you. I actually don't think correction jobs should be 20 or 30-year careers. I actually think that there should be like a Teach for America model where people go in and they work for 5 or 6 years, and that is a stepping stone to something else they go off and do. I find that the commitment to it as a lifelong endeavor means that eventually they get hardened and also suddenly become a lobby for the system that we currently have. And I think that is a dynamic that we may not have created intentionally, but that is a genuine dynamic. If I don't get the dream the way I just did, and I have to talk to a correction official, someone who's young and going into the system, I would remind them that I would probably tell the story I told you earlier about how this correction official said to me, you should go to college. Because sometimes you don't realize that you plant the seed that grows into a tree that casts shade that you will never benefit from. And you have to have faith that planting that seed still will have impact. Like my ability to meet with the president of the United States comes from that person who said to me, you should go to college many, 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 many years earlier. My ability to free hundreds, if not thousands of people from prison over the last 2 decades comes from that person planting that seed. And so I would just really help them understand how every time they open their mouth and utter something, that they can literally not just change the trajectory of one individual, but of many, many, many people exponentially as a result. And I think that when you talk about our criminal justice system and you talk about mass incarceration, the better job you do of describing it is the more you make people feel helpless in terms of their ability to do anything about it. And so I would want that correction official to realize that actually nothing has changed this world, if you quote Margaret Mead, except for a small group of people who really believed, and that that individual can be the one to plant that seed.
I love that Margaret Mead quote, by the way. We briefly touched on restorative justice earlier, and I promised the listeners we were going to circle back to that. Restorative justice has gained some attention as an alternative approach to traditional punitive measures as of late. Glenn, how do you think this model could be integrated into our current correction and probation systems to promote what we've been talking about here, more of this healing, more of this perspective taking, more of this reconciliation, and less of this binary us versus them lens that we too often take?
That's a really good question. Couple of things. One, when I think of Jack Dorsey's philanthropic effort, Jack Dorsey as the Jack Dorsey who founded Twitter, he has a philanthropic effort called Start Small. And for a guy that's created something so large multiple times, the idea that his foundation is called Start Small, I think, is an indicator to the rest of us that you got to start somewhere. And so the first thing I would say is I think we need to continue to create these small endeavors as much as possible, not be overly ambitious in the beginning, but recognize that if we got here through a million cuts, then we're probably going to get out of it through a million Band-Aids, if you will. And so we need to just continue to create these small efforts that change the minds of people locally and then ultimately have national impact. Because then people, again, get overwhelmed. How do you scale it? How do you scale it? How do you scale it? Well, maybe you don't start there. Maybe just start small, start locally, change minds, and then trust that that will go off and blossom into something. Second thing I would say is I think that people who believe in restorative justice have to do a better job of practicing it first. Like, if you want the rest of the country to believe that you believe genuinely in restorative justice, then you really need to show them the way. Like, you don't tell people what the future is going to look like. Like, you literally model it. And I think that we have to continue to find ways to model it, even in the movement to change our criminal justice system. And it really is a different approach, because here's what it says if you think of it in its most authentic version. In its authentic version, you literally meet people as equals. You don't do the degrading that you talked about earlier and then say, okay, let's all come together. So right now, what we're trying to do is fit a square peg into a round hole. We have a square peg that has value and that we want to move toward, but we're trying to fit it into our current criminal justice system. And so it requires like a district attorney to allow you to be diverted into a program, and then for there to be some kind of punitiveness on the back end if you don't make it through. And that's the challenge I think we're going to have with trying to, because what we're really saying is let's move to a system with a different set of values. And for that to work, people have to meet as equals. And it is hard for people to wrap their head around the idea that someone who's caused harm can be an equal. But I think as a human being having self-worth, inherent worth, you can have people meet as equals. It doesn't mean that someone doesn't need to repair the harm, or do work on themselves or do work in the community. All of that needs to happen. But if you meet with one person less empowered than the other, then you actually create a dynamic that replicates our current criminal justice system. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with figuring out how we go from this adversarial, mean-spirited, punitive, system that we have now to one that actually is practiced in other places around the world very successfully. And I think, again, because you have to literally get people to think differently, you just really start small and realize that you'll hit a tipping and trust that you hit a tipping point. And since I talked about Obama earlier, I don't usually go around quoting him, but you reminded me of a quote, which is someone asked him, were you surprised after a few years in office that you weren't able to change things to the extent that you thought you would have when you got the job? And he said, what I learned is that if you take a ship and you change its trajectory by just 1 or 2 degrees, it's going to end up somewhere else. And so if we're doing restorative justice, we just got to shift it by a couple of degrees and trust that somewhere down the line, that ship is going to be somewhere totally different.
Yeah, got to remain positive. Hey, I don't want to let you leave without talking about your current ventures with Gem Real Estate. You are founder and president of Gem Real Estate. Talk about, Glenn, how you are leveraging your expertise in criminal justice reform to address housing challenges which are faced by formerly incarcerated individuals and help promote that stable reintegration, which we know just that stability coming out of prison is such a huge challenge at times.
Yeah, when I came out of prison, I had housing instability. I wasn't able to vote, employment challenges, which I mentioned earlier. So I didn't face all of the stigma other people faced and all of the barriers, but I did face enough for me to realize that it is difficult to overcome those challenges. And so about 6 years ago, I went into the private sector and launched a nonprofit consulting firm. And then about 2 years later, launched a real estate investment firm. And always wanted to, get into real estate, mostly as a way to just diversify income and having a way to be able to be an advocate without worrying about where the next buck is coming from. But I realized as I learned how to navigate the real estate market, the private sector, that there are ways to actually take properties that are neglected, rehab them, and continue to rent them for not much more than they were renting for before I acquired them. Why? Because some slum landlord before me let them deteriorate, and that means they have equity inside of them. So I figured out a way to extract that equity, use that equity to rehab the houses, and continue to rent them to people on Section 8, which are low-income people, but also people with criminal records. And how did I get to the people with criminal records part? I realized that the management companies that I was using to rent these houses, I have 90 houses at this point, were actually saying to me, oh, don't worry, we'll screen out people with criminal records. And I was like, not really. Not in this case, you won't. And they were shocked to hear it. In fact, I was just text messaging with the mayor of Savannah, Georgia, which is where some of my properties are. And they're always bewildered. I'm like, look, some of my houses are in violent neighborhoods with violence. There's gunshots, blah, blah, blah. And, the mayor's like, okay, we'll talk to the police department. I'm like, wait. There's other solutions here. I'm trying to provide stable, affordable housing to people with criminal records. Let's have a conversation about how to be more creative, instead of doing what we've been doing and getting the same results. So I am just pleased to be at a point in my career where I can enter an entirely different sector and at the same time do it in a way that lines up with my values and what I care about. And I think that, if people don't have a key to turn at the end of the day, good luck with the job, good luck with the health care, good luck with anything else if a person doesn't feel like they have a safe, affordable place to rest their head at the end of the day.
Yeah, 100%, Glenn, 100%. Let's dare to dream here. Glenn, if I've got you back on the podcast in 5 years, look into your crystal ball, what do you think we might be talking about in the future?
That we're shocked that we were able to reduce our prison population by half. I actually think that if you're not being bold and audacious and ambitious, good luck. I think that if you shoot for the stars, wherever you land, it's going to be a great place. So I think we have to be bold, and I think we have to be audacious. And I guess, if there's any beauty in the mess that we've created, is that it's not sustainable. What we've done is just not, I live in a city where it costs $356,000 per bed per year to lock people up. That's just not sustainable. And so we do have to find solutions. And what I love is that when I started this work 23 years ago and I was going around to places like APPA to speak publicly, people would sort of tilt their head and look at me as if I had two heads. And those days are over. We have architects and doctors and lawyers and teachers, everyone talking about criminal justice. And that, to me, creates the opportunity to do something different. And I remain confident. I think leaders are dealers in hope. So I'm very hopeful that we'll get to a place where, at the very least, we've cut our population by half.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Glenn Martin, thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you again, and we will follow your exploits and your crusade and the movement, as you say, and wish you the best of luck, my friend.
Great. Thanks for being on again. Keep up the good work.
Right, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
What a truly enlightening conversation. A massive thank you to our distinguished guest, Glenn Martin, for sharing his profound insights and deeply personal journey with us today. For our listeners who are intrigued by our chat around Glenn's daily news op-ed, which he penned, you can dive deeper into his thoughts at the link provided in our show notes. Simply click on that daily news link to have access to that op-ed piece. Also, if you're intrigued by the Jonathan Fisher documentary, which we referenced, entitled In a Whole New Way, be sure to check it out at the link I have also provided in the episode description of this podcast. It is a viewing experience that truly resonates. Now, for all of you heading to the American Probation and Parole Association Training Institute in New York City this August of 2023, here is your golden opportunity. Come find me. Not only would I love to chat, but you might even have a chance to be interviewed on the spot for a future episode of the Criminologist podcast, sharing your experiences and insights from the conference. An unforgettable experience awaits. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, for those keen on diving deeper into core correctional skills, implementation, or the topic of desistance from crime, please reach out through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com. We are here for trainings, presentations, and more. If you have any queries or comments about this episode, we'd love to hear them. Shoot us an email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Stay updated and connected with us on our various platforms. Our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. We are constantly updating them with fresh, fun content you don't want to miss out. Over on Twitter, you can follow us at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and follow us for the latest updates. For the professionals in the crowd, connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and keep up with both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. For those visually inclined, our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, offers enriching content that dovetails with our podcast themes. Subscribe now for a deeper dive. And hey, if you're feeling the podcast love and want a tangible piece of it, we've got Criminologist coffee mugs up for grabs. Contact us for details on our merchandise. But most importantly, if you're vibing with our mission, if you're part of this crucial movement, help us grow. Spread the word, tell someone about us, urge them to subscribe, and if you haven't done so already, now's the time to hit that subscribe button. Let's continue to grow and build our community of like-minded individuals. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
He talks about it as if remaining neutral is the pinnacle of doing the right thing. And I'm like, then why is your job called correction officer? Why is it not called neutral officer?
I love it.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.